What's up, you gentle sons and comely Welcome to my Witcher book club. You may enter if you can say Wicked Witch of the Wang 5 times fast. So spoiler alert, I'll be doing some summarizing to make sure we're all on the same page. But really, I want to get to sharing my thoughts on this book being The Sword of Destiny. So I jumped right into this book, and about halfway into it, I realized that this isn't actually the first book in the series. But it's alright, because this is one of the 2 short storybooks that helps create the foundation for the later novels. In fact, I'd say half of these stories could actually stand on their own fairly well. So, as you may have guessed, for the most part, this book centers around the theme of destiny, and in particular, the question of whether 2 people could be destined for each other, or perhaps, destiny alone is not enough, and something more is needed. And what could that something more be? These are the burning questions. So The Sword of Destiny is broken up into 6 short stories, the first being called The Bounds of Reason. It begins with the Witcher Geralt in a dark cave fighting a basilisk. So the author, Andrzej Sarkowski, likes to put his own twist on things. In Slavic folklore, the term basilisk is sometimes used interchangeably with the term cockatrice. They're basically bird raptor versions of Medusa. They turn you to stone if you look at them, and sometimes even just by inhaling their stench. And the most straightforward way to defeat them is with a mirror, to turn their ability back on them. But Geralt doesn't even take a mirror with him, just a sword. You see, in his stories, Sarkowski likes to deconstruct fairy tales and other folklore. The villagers waiting at the entrance of the cave say that you can't defeat a basilisk without a looking glass. But it's entirely possible that these special traits of the basilisk are just a myth within the Witcher universe. And apparently, cockatrices are a separate species in this universe, and they're created by the union of a rooster and another rooster. But anyways, we don't actually get the play-by-play of this fight. Instead, we see the villagers outside. 2 of them in particular figure that the Witcher must have perished, or at least use that as a premise to take his things and horse. But before they can do this knight named Borscht shows up and tells them to stop. But they don't want to stop, and they threaten Borsch's life. So he calls in his 2 female Zeracanian warriors, Thea and Vea. These girls are described as being rather muscular and having face paint somewhat like an Argentinian soccer fan. The important thing to note about them is that they're great in a fight, great in bed, or the tub if you prefer, and that their people worship an idol of a dragon. So Geralt emerges from the cave with a limp dead basilisk. Quickly assessing the situation, he collects his pay and then essentially tells the villagers present to get out of his sight if they know what's good for them. He thanks Borscht, also known as 3 Jackdars, and compliments one of the Zeracanian women for the way she had neatly decapitated one of the villagers who had pulled a knife on Borscht. Long story short, Geralt gets invited to go to an inn with Borscht and his girls, where Borscht starts splashing cash on an extravagant meal and an actual keg of beer, followed by many pitchers. The girls don't eat a lot though because they're quote watching their figures, but they do drink about 2,000 calories in beer and start drooling over Geralt. Borscht is like, they like you, but Geralt, smiling sadly, is like, why wouldn't they? Honestly, I don't know why he's supposed to be sad at this point. Maybe just that log driver soup, the crayfish, the lamb, and all that beer aren't sitting right. Anyways, Borscht 3 Jackdaws chats with Geralt about the limits of the Witcher profession, and particularly about how Geralt, as a Witcher, refuses to hunt dragons. Not the green, the red, the black, or the white dragons. And Borscht is like, what about the golden dragons? Geralt simply responds that golden dragons are just a myth, and that if a gold dragon was to appear through an unlikely mutation, that it would be beyond the limits of possibility for the species to survive, because a mutant is infertile. If this guy projected any harder, he'd be the first movie theater. You see, Witchers are infertile, and they're also considered mutants because in the process of creating a Witcher, the body has to go through certain changes. But to say that this infertility must also extend to golden dragons, with barely any knowledge on this hypothetical beast. I mean, this is a world where 2 roosters, that's male chickens for you city folk, can create a whole new creature. And by the way, Zeracania was named after a golden dragon of legend. According to this legend, the dragon, Zeracantermint, burned the forests around Zeracania, making it isolated by deserts and wastelands. Which does lead a bit of credence to the Netflix interpretation of Thea and Vea. But golden, silvered, military camo, and polka dot dragons aside, Geralt and Borsch's chat also gets into their thoughts on the forces of order and chaos. According to Borscht, chaos is an aggressive force that threatens order, which needs protecting. In my opinion, frankly, that definition is left very open to interpretation on a case-by-case basis, and depends very much on the person's investment in the situation. One person's order could be another's chaos. To use an example from the book, the Dryads see nature, and in particular the trees, as an order worth protecting, and the humans who would cut down those trees to create their houses, their ships, and so on are the chaos that threaten that order. Meanwhile, the humans invested in the lumber and other connected industries would see the Dryads with the arrows that they let fly in defense of the trees as the chaos that threatens their preferred order. Now, the reason Geralt has for not hunting dragons is that, according to him, they do not prey on humans. And as he explains later in the story, it is humans who prey on dragons for their hoards of treasure. There's one small problem with that logic though, as one does have to question how these dragons amass all that treasure in the first place. Whether they like to target nobles for eating whole and incidentally poop out their jewels later, or they like to forcefully take things that men prize, just to humiliate them. It's clear that, although they're mostly extinct in settled lands, where they do exist, they can be more than just a nuisance. Strangely enough, dragons are often compared with cats in this universe, so one might try to illustrate their impact on the world by seeing them as house cats, meaning cats that are the size of houses. Another character that we meet in this story, the sorcerer Doragore, espouses the druidic theory of natural equilibrium, within which, for example, the hunting down and extermination of man's natural enemies will upset the equilibrium and cause humanity to degenerate. Now there is some truth to this, as they say iron sharpens iron, or in this case, fire and teeth and claws sharpen iron, or maybe just thin out the human herd from time to time. But nature will always gravitate towards equilibrium, and to assume that it would do so through the degeneration of man is just, well, the kind of thing a haughty sorcerer would be expected to say. Anyways, so the events of the next day lead to Geralt, Borsch, and his girls. Geralt's bird friend Dandelion, Geralt's ex-girl who he randomly walked out on 4 years ago, the sorceress Yennefer, the sorcerer Doragore, a group of dwarves, a monster hunting trio known as the Crimfried Reavers, as well as the young King Nidamir and his company, all hunting down a green dragon that had been baited into eating a poisoned sheep carcass. The beast survived though and limped away into the mountains, but Nidamir wants to see the job finished. Now I am trying to avoid getting swamped in details here, so it will suffice to say that King Nidamir wants to take credit for the slaying of this dragon in order to fulfill a certain prophecy that will cement his rule over new lands. So he organized this little expedition with promises of a large cut of the dragon's hoard to whoever can bring the beast down. All he really wants out of this is a piece of the dragon as proof of his conquest. One of the most interesting members of this band is the knight errant, Ike of Denazle, who has a reputation for taking on any creature in the defense of those in need, and not asking for payment like a witcher or really any sensible person would, considering the danger. He has an obsession with a certain aesthetic of chivalry, one mostly confined to fairy tales. He also has fewer scruples over what he is willing to exterminate in the defense of those in need than witchers do. And he's not fond of witchers either, not because they charge, but because he sees them as an abomination against nature. He doesn't have many good words for sorcerers or non-human pagans like dwarves either. I think Ike is a vehicle for poking fun at the perfect fairy tale knightly code of chivalry. For example, maybe if he had a bit more nuance in his code of chivalry, he wouldn't have ended up lying broken after fighting a telepathic golden dragon who had challenged him to a duel. Earlier, he has stated they had reached the limits of possibility, courting misfortune by having all these heathens come along with them on their hunt. But maybe he should have considered his own personal limits, or again, the limits of knightly honor. Maybe he didn't have to do this. And he was the best dragon hunter to serve directly under King Nidamir, and the king saw the writing on the wall when his overbearing, overweight minister Galinstiern, who had been speaking for him this whole time, finally asked him what he wanted to do at this point. He's like, okay boomer, we go now, while we still can. Forget the prophecy, I've got troops. The most sensible young King Nidamir recognized the limits of possibility, aka the bounds of reason. Now, shortly before this duel, this dragon, Valentro Tenmirth, had brought a landslide down on this hunting party, which led to Geralt hanging on to a broken and dangling bit of bridge, and Yennefer, again the sorceress who he had walked out on, hanging on to Geralt, and there's a long fall beneath them. He's like, this might be the end, can you forgive me now, Yen? She's like, never. And then of all people, Ike saves them using a magical rope. So Yennefer asks Ike why he would save a sorcerer like her, and he tells her that her comely and honest face suggests that she might one day give up this accursed sorcery. What a complicated man, and to Geralt, he simply says he'll help anyone in need. Now after Nidamir picks up the broken Ike and takes off home, Yennefer offers Geralt her forgiveness in exchange for the remains of a golden dragon. Because you see, due to the effects that the use of magic has on their bodies, sorcerers are infertile, and she's baby crazy. Her biological clock won't tick, but it goes cuckoo all the same. But anyways, she's discovered this procedure that might be able to give her back what she so desires, fecundity and fecundity again. But it's a very complicated procedure, and she needs some serious loot to get it done. A golden dragon hide, for example. She points out that this dragon is terribly fast, and that only a witcher with his enhanced reflexes could hope to match the beast. Geralt is like, why don't you just do it, Yen? She's like, nah, I'm just gonna hang back here and barbecue anyone who thinks they're gonna take a cut of this sweet loot. Geralt won't do it though. He says her forgiveness has stopped mattering to him. After all, she's coming across as terribly manipulative. He won't do it, even though the whole reason he came along on this hunt was because she was there. It's like, if you won't forgive me hanging from a broken bridge, you don't get to forgive me just so I'll squeeze a dragon in your fridge. Like, who needs a witcher when we got the witcher right here? So at this point, Doragore makes his move. He forbids the slaying of this endangered golden dragon, possibly the last of its kind, which only causes Yennefer, the Reavers, and the dwarves to pile onto him, and so the scramble begins. By the end of it, Yennefer, Geralt, Doragore, and Dandelion are all tied to a cart, and Yennefer has her blouse ripped open and her milkers out, the idea being that all the Reavers and the dwarves intend to have their turn with her, with their performance against the dragon deciding the order, which I think is the play on the whole dragon taking the damsel hostage trope. In this case, for the sake of the damsel, you'd root for the dragon. So Valentro Tenmirth easily beats the dwarves and the Reavers, but like with Ike, leaves them alive. When later the Bearfield Constabulary shows up and nearly defeats him. However, he's not nearly as merciful. Bearfield being the town where Geralt and the rest set out from, and where the cobbler Shoebagger came up with the bright idea to poison that green dragon. Shoebagger gets the special treatment, as Valentro Tenmirth chomps down on him, presumably rather inefficiently, given his screaming. This whole poisoned sheep situation is also a play on a certain fairy tale, except in that story the dragon exploded, because whatever was in that sheep made it super thirsty, and it drank like a whole lake. So the Bearfielders have Valentro Tenmirth tied up in several nets, and they're about to move in for the killing blow, when over the hill comes the Zerrikanians, who start mopping them up, and Yennefer has gotten a foot free from the cart, and casting spells with it that are turning the Bearfielders into woodland animals. Like she's so angry her spells have gone Disney. Anyways, the big reveal is that Valentro Tenmirth and golden dragons in general are shapeshifters. In his human form, he's a knight who goes by Borsch, or 3 Jackdaws, and his coat of arms is 3 black birds over a golden field, with the name Valentro Tenmirth meaning 3 black birds. Now going back to Borsch and Geralt's talk about order and chaos, from Borsch's perspective, it is humans who represent the chaos that threatens the order of certain intelligent beasts, and he works as a sort of wisher for them, protecting them from the humans. One hint to this I've noticed is that he's pointed out to have incredible reflexes and speed, which is something that witchers are noted for compared to ordinary humans. So he was hired to protect the green dragon that was poisoned outside Bearfield, and she managed to take off during all this commotion, but left behind his reward, her baby Green. I know, right? Imagine putting your life on the line to help out some woman, and as your reward she dumps her kid on you. But maybe I'm just not framing that properly. Maybe, as alluded to earlier, Valentro Tenmirth is a mutant, and is also infertile. Maybe his idea of survival is the raising and passing on what he knows to baby Green. Let's just put a bookmark on that thought, because there's certain other infertile mutants in the vicinity, and it may come up again. Seriously, everything in this book rhymes in some way with something else. And there's certain phrases, such as in this story, the limits of possibility, that get used again and again by different characters. It's used with different meanings in mind though, which I think helps to illustrate the separate characters' personalities. So after finishing off the Bearfield constabulary, Valentro Tenmirth calls off his Zerrikanians. And just as Vea was about to cut down Yennefer, who earlier, after asking Geralt, had planned to slay the dragon herself, in the hopes of overcoming her own much lamented limits of possibility. So right then and there, Geralt and Yennefer get back together. I don't know why. Before taking off with Little Green, Valentro Tenborsch has a look at the happy couple, and says that they're made for each other, but nothing will come of it. And speaking of which, I've looked into interviews and such surrounding this book, and originally, Yennefer was intended to be a one-off character, but I guess you could say one should not be too quick to define the limits of possibility. But also, why doesn't she keep trying to get that procedure to fix up her baby factory? There's other ways to make money. Before we move on to the next story, and lots more yet, one quote from this one that stuck with me was when 3 Jackdaws told Geralt that there's a destination at the end of every road. Geralt had been talking about how as a witcher, he's destined to roam about, from monster hunt to monster hunt, but with no real destination. And it doesn't help things that the pay isn't as good as it should be, and that a lot of people have unpleasant reactions to witchers, leaving him feeling isolated. But nevertheless, Geralt seems to have the habit of not really thinking through the things that he says from time to time. And in this case, I think he selectively ignored a few facts about life, such as the fact that if you refuse to make a decision about where you want to end up, you still necessarily have to end up somewhere, and for that matter, you still made a decision. To quote Geralt from this particular story, "A sword is a sword once drawn." This is from when he had resolved to protect the dragon from the hunters. And I might be wrong, but I feel like this is meant to apply to the Sword of Destiny itself as well. Once you feel that uncomfortable sensation and pull the Sword of Destiny out of your butt, something's gonna happen. And if you recognize it for what it is, and wield it properly, you might suddenly have a destination in mind. Something like that. A Shard of Ice. The title of this one refers to a story of an elf queen who bewitched men, getting her little shards of ice in their eyes so that they see no beauty in anything but the pure whiteness of snow. This story is based loosely on a fairy tale called the Snow Queen, and is used quite frequently as a metaphor for Yennefer. And it's not just about the effect that she has on the men in her life, it's about how these little shards of ice cover up her own insecurities. Like the elf queen, what Yennefer desires most is simply warmth, real intimacy. She fears that that very warmth would melt the shard of ice and expose her true self. So A Shard of Ice begins with Geralt fighting the trash compactor monster from Star Wars. In this universe, it's called a Zoogle, and it's infested the trash heap just outside of a little town called Aegein Vale, which is elder speech for a shard of ice. Geralt has decided to pot up for this fight with his Witcher potions. Basically, they increase his fighting abilities in the short term, and they're so potent that a non-Witcher would likely die taking them. For Geralt, it's just like a full-body hangover when the potions have run their course. So after beating the Zoogle, he heads over to His and Yen's apartment because they happen to be together now. He has a much-needed bath, and then gets frisky with Yennefer, which requires some assistance because he can't get it up on his own in this state. They also have a little chat about how monsters are capable of adapting to the changes that humans make to the environment, and how Geralt may one day start living and doing his work in the cities. I think this is in direct reference to a real-world phenomenon. I mean, just off the top of my head, rats, crows, and pigeons, and to a certain extent things like coyotes and foxes, have all proven capable of taking advantage of so-called artificial environments created by humans. And I say so-called because we're a part of nature too, so it's not artificial, it's just change. Anyways, during this whole conversation, she keeps name-dropping her sorcerer acquaintance, Istrid, who lives in town. So she keeps bringing up this Istrid fella, saying all these positive things about him, and Geralt starts feeling less and less like he's the only man in her life. It's not a good feeling. The events of the next day, combined with that not-so-good feeling in his gut, lead to Geralt having a nice one-on-one chat with Istrid at his house, where they can both get some clarity. And I say that with some irony, because both of them are ensnared by a tiny shard of ice. It's really quite an intense bit of dialogue. Both of them know deep down what's going on, but they spend some time feeling each other out. Both of them, but especially Istrid, demonstrate a lot of disarming candor. He explains to Geralt why sorcerers generally express that they find a witcher like him to be detestable. The reason being that witchers only dabble in magic, whereas sorcerers are raised to believe that it's a higher art form, which demands respect and true commitment out of those that would use it. And when Geralt confronts Istrid about how magic requires so many rare, difficult to obtain, and downright gruesome ingredients, Istrid spills the beans about how those are mostly just stories that sorcerers spread about their profession, and that magic can actually be performed with rather common ingredients. They just don't want the rabble to start dabbling in it, because again, they have so much reverence for the art. Of course, they also maintain a certain mystique, and make more money this way too. If you ask me, I think Istrid at this point is using all this honesty to try and soften Geralt up a little bit. And I say this despite him later pointing out that witchers are mutants devoid of true feeling, which, at least in Geralt's case, clearly isn't true. He's been feeling irritated all morning, which might have something to do with how Yennefer rushed out the door that morning before he even woke up to go see Istrid. Anyways, Istrid points to this supposed lack of feeling, just to say that he can afford to be blunt with the Witcher. He bluntly requests that Geralt remove himself from Yennefer's life, as he wants her all to himself. And he again points out that Geralt lacks true feeling, just to point out that he can provide Yennefer with the emotional support which Geralt is not capable of. Going back to what I said earlier though, I do believe that he intentionally buttered up Geralt before getting into this heavy stuff. I've noticed that characters in this book are often written this way. They'll say one thing, but when you take a closer look at their actions, they appear to be working under slightly different presumptions. So this very tense conversation comes to a head with the question of who has more right to Yennefer basically. Geralt points out that he has a right to draw a few conclusions due to the fact that he made love with Yennefer last night, and Istrid comes right back with, well, she made love with me this morning, so draw your conclusions, I already have. And Geralt was too riled up at this point to come up with a single joke about sloppy seconds. He goes back to Yen, who's like, I know how you feel now, and I'm sorry about that, but I don't feel guilty. This is the same woman who threatened to fry Geralt's eyes out because he walked out on her. The same woman who dragged Geralt to Aegein Vale because she wanted to see Istrid, with every intention of giving up the coochie. And to look at things from Istrid's perspective, he wants something serious with Yen, not just the on-again, off-again relationship they've been having for a long time now. He told this to Yen and is allowing her time to decide, but now he feels like Geralt is in the way because he's causing her to hold off on this decision. And it's not just Geralt and Istrid either. She takes those two the most seriously, but Yen, the Elf Queen, admits that every year she ensnares a new man with her shard of ice. Every year. Only those two matter, but she's gotta have her side boys, right? According to Geralt, presumably because she's a sorceress, she can't be held to normal standards. I really don't understand why though. Can y'all comment below with why you think this might be? Preferably something other than just she's a So, during this conversation, Geralt repeats some words that Istrid said about him, that he's a mutant, who only experiences the atavistic remnants of feeling in a body purged of emotion. And Yen freaks out, like never say that word in my presence again. The word is mutant, and I think the reason why she has such a hang-up about this word goes back to her being infertile. I mean, there isn't much that doesn't, and maybe that's what those different standards are all about. She has to keep trying with different men to stay half sane. Now, there's a lot to unpack in these conversations. One thing, which I've already mentioned, is that Yennefer is insecure, believing that if she was to get too close to Geralt or Istrid and melt the shard of ice she placed in them, that they would see the real her and be reduced to an ordinary woman in her eyes. This insecurity of hers actually reminds me of how Istrid revealed to Geralt that sorcerers spread lies about their profession, just to give it the appearance of being less accessible and in effect more special. It also reminds me of how Yennefer can use magic to maintain her youthful good looks for centuries. And to get even more unnecessarily meta, magic itself is really just science that isn't generally understood. If you go back a couple hundred years with a smartphone, a dirt bike, and a cup of instant noodles, you better go prepared to be burned at the stake. Now Yennefer is also afflicted with a shard of ice. As the black kestrel, which she creates out of thin air in front of Geralt, states, the truth is a shard of ice. And the truth is that while she has fond feelings for both men, she She could not return the deep feelings of affection that Istrid has for her. In her words, there are some gifts you can't accept unless you are able to give something in return, something equally valuable. In other words, it's not really about Geralt holding her up. She just doesn't feel the same for Istrid as Istrid feels for her. And as for Geralt, well, Istrid's words really did a number on the guy. Yennefer asked Geralt to say the words, what I assume to be the ILU words, even though she herself refuses to say them to him. But that's just Yennefer. She can't be held to normal standards. She herself is like, I don't know, but what kind of answer is that? And Geralt can't bring himself to say the words. Well, actually, it's just one word according to the translation I read. You see, Sarkowski is Polish, and there are some translation mistakes, or maybe just misunderstandings here and there. But anyways, Geralt won't say the word, I love you, Yen, because Istrid got the idea in his head that his feelings aren't real. He told Geralt that emotionally, he was as empty as the skull he was holding from an archaeological dig. And now, when Yen asks him to say the word, he responds with, it would be nothing but a word, like the sound made when you strike a cold, empty skull. And this metaphor carries on for a while. In her monologue about seeking truth, she asks, who is the empty skull, and who is overflowing with emotion? Maybe both Geralt and Istrid are the ones overflowing with emotion, and she is the empty skull, because truth is a shard of ice. Geralt is not unfeeling, and there's an inference that the folk belief that witchers don't feel emotion is a self-fulfilling prophecy. They don't get treated like normal people. And if you've ever been in a situation where you're being dehumanized, but you know you have to endure it to survive, you'll realize that one way to cope is to go cold. Like when the mayor's hired thug Cicada tries to goad Geralt into a fight. He states that he doesn't believe in the stories about witchers being ruthless killing machines and proposes that they meet in an alleyway to feed his curiosity. He calls it a wager. 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. But Geralt was on his way to Istrid's house at that time and could barely spare the energy to humor the guy. Later though, when Cicada once again interrupts Geralt's day, demanding a fight, Geralt tricks the guy into dropping his guard and then just smashes him with a sucker punch, turns his lips into mashed cherries. He's had quite enough of this town treating him like he can't feel, and now he's overflowing with emotion. He boots Cicada in the head and carries on with his affairs. But back to the main plot. After his chat with Yen, Geralt finds himself wandering around town, and somehow, without consciously trying to, he finds himself at the archaeological dig site where he knew Istrid would be. The two of them come to an agreement that Yennefer has no intention of choosing between them, were she even capable of it. They also agree that both of them want Yennefer all for themselves. So Istrid tells Geralt that there can only be one, and Geralt tells Istrid that indeed, there can only be one.
There can be only one!
They say he's wandered from battlefield to battlefield over hundreds of years. He can't be killed unless you cut off his head. But if you do, you get all his powers. There can be only one!
After this, there will be only one.
The only one!
俺はそんな肩書きはいらねえ。だが、竜は一匹でいい。ああ、お前の言う通りだ。
There can be only one.
They also agree that both of them feel like they're being really dumb, but they can't help it. They shake hands. The duel is set for tomorrow morning. Geralt, knowing he needs to be in tip-top shape tomorrow if he's going to stand a chance facing a sorcerer, heads straight to the bar. There's a scene where the mayor shows up and tries to bribe him into not going through with this duel because the town can't afford another sorcerer. But Geralt simply shows a flash of anger. Like Mayor Herbolth, get your hideous face out of my hideous face. And then he shows depression. He flashes his purse in front of an unsavory looking character at the bar. He then leaves and allows himself to be cornered in a dark alley without his weapons. He gets mugged by the man he saw in the bar and another. And honestly, he had a club versus Geralt's bare fists, but as a witcher, he probably still could have beaten them if he wanted to. They take his purse and are about to cut his throat, but then they see his witcher medallion, and they're so afraid of witchers that they run away from one that they just bashed in the head with a club. I mean, Geralt was smiling when he allowed the guy to hit him, and after, so that's a bit unsettling. Before leaving, one of them tells Geralt that if he wants to end his life, he shouldn't drag other people into it. So the morning of the duel comes. That little episode with Cicada happens, but Geralt still makes it on time, and is surprised to see that Istrid intends not to fight with magic, but with a sword. And Istrid is raring to go, but Geralt demands to know why he intends to fight this way, as he should be aware that he doesn't stand much chance at all against a witcher with just a sword. So Istrid reveals to Geralt that Yennefer had sent him a black kestrel with a message, saying goodbye, and that there are some gifts which cannot be accepted without also giving something of equal value. The second line to this, which he told Geralt earlier, is that otherwise, such a gift would melt through your fingers, like a shard of ice in a closed fist. So Istrid again demands that they fight right away, but Geralt just turns around and repeats the words that he was told the night before, that he shouldn't drag others into his own sewer slide. He then leaves, leaving Istrid breaking down and screaming behind him. He's a total mess. During their earlier conversation, Geralt saw Yennefer create a second black kestrel for him. The first one delivered that message to Istrid, and Geralt expects to find not Yennefer, but the second kestrel in his apartment, with a similar message. But not exactly. I get the sense that Yen's feelings for Geralt are stronger than her feelings for Istrid, but Geralt won't put it to voice that he loves her. there, so he gets a kestrel too. It's like your consolation prize, a pretty bird. Anyways folks, these are some pretty dense stories, aren't they? At this point, I'm gonna call it a video. We'll return to Sword of Destiny, but first I think I should actually go and cover the first book, The Last Wish. That way we can then go forward without being too confused about anything. So if you like this video, give me a comment, leave a like, subscribe. Just accept my shard. I'll be back soon.